performer of the 1930s, Leslie Hutch Hutchinson.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, I have another treat in store for you. Hutch is going to entertain us again.
Oh, very good. Very good, very good, very good. Needless to say, I'm sorry. You've made up your mind to go. Needless to say...
In the 1930s and 40s, Leslie Hutchinson was the star of British cabaret. But today, he's almost completely forgotten. All that remains are his records and the people whose lives he touched. I'm Nigel Dempster, and I was lucky enough to have known Hutch. And in this program, I'm going to be telling the story of the most flamboyant and larger-than-life man I ever knew.
No regrets, although love affair has gone astray. No regrets.
Leslie A. Hutchinson first came to England in 1927. Then he was a young black pianist from Grenada in the Caribbean, and he'd come to take society by storm after learning his trade on the streets of Harlem. Charlotte Breeze, author of a recent biography of Hutch.
Harlem at the time was the place where any black in America wanted to be. That was the terrifically exciting new place to be. And the music was fantastic and was developing very fast.
In Harlem in the 1920s, Hutch had learnt stride and jazz piano and was well regarded by the jazz greats.
He started working as a pianist, and he became an accompanist to some quite well-known blues shouters.
Although a very good jazz pianist, he was not a great pianist by the incredible standards of 1920s Harlem. So he left for Paris.
Paris was important to Hutch because he knew a lot of people who were already successful there and who made the next group contacts for him. He met Cole Porter, who became his lover, as well as a great friend and mentor, and who took him to Venice, where he met the jet set, and thus he came to meet British aristocracy, who were to become his clients in London.
In the thriving world of London's cabaret clubs, Hutch began to refine his art.
The nightclubs in London in 1927 were many and various. There were lots of them that were extremely scruffy. They were mostly patronized by rich people. Cabaret in those days would have meant for Hutch him singing to probably only 50 people who would have been not silent, as we have known cabarets entertaining latterly, but clattering about, knives, forks, heaven knows what else, loads of noise, loads of smoking, lots of drinking. And then, if the performer was good enough, then they'd quieten down. And Hutch always said that to keep them quiet, you sang quietly.
London, like Paris, offered Hutch the chance to be a big fish in a very much smaller pond. But what London and the world of the cabaret clubs offered Hutch, most of all, was a chance to develop his own style of performance. And what he succeeded in creating was an experience few who saw it forgot.
When they begin,
regardless of whoever was on the bill, they were a blank.
Jessie Pilling, still a huge fan, first saw Hutch in the 1930s.
All you wanted them to do was to get on and get off again. Then comes that magical moment, and the whole body is going tense, and the curtains open, and then he sort of glides towards you, goes to the piano, sits down, begins to sing.
He knew how to walk on the stage. In cabaret, he used to come on and he used to just play on the keys for a minute, look around, smile, nod, as if he knew people.
Hutch's former agent, Lou Lane, remembers Hutch's majestic performances.
He would always wear his carnation. He would always be immaculate. When he did variety, he wore tails. And then he would go into songs.
And it's a one-to-one experience. He seemed to sense exactly where I was sat, and as though there were only the two of us in that theatre. And I'm sure that the rest of his audience must have felt the same.
In the world of showmanship and glamour, Hutch quickly developed another essential part of his cabaret act, a gimmick. It was a trademark that would stay with him for the rest of his life, a silk handkerchief. Lou Lane once more.
He would be very flamboyant with a handkerchief. It would be in his top pocket, you know, hand-rolled, Swiss, beautiful, and he would put it out after the number, shake it, and just tap it on his face, you know, and it became very famous. After that, it wasn't in his pocket, it was on the piano.
The London pianist, Patrick Barry.
He'd wave his handkerchief at beautiful ladies in the audience and be quite suggestive, really.
When I used to see Hutch perform, very much later, he was still patting his face with this silk handkerchief, and it was still very much part of his act. In London, Hutch's relationship with Cole Porter stood him in good stead. Not only did it add to his reputation, as the true nature of that relationship was not really known until after Hutch's death, it also gave him almost ownership over some of Porter's best songs. And the one he really made his own was the song that perfectly fitted the world of decadence, wealth, and Hutch's new aristocratic friends. It was called Let's Do It. Lou Lane.
When the little bluebird was never said a word starts to sing spring, spring. And the little
Hutch was big, very, very big. He had a great following. A lot of people, debutants, things like that, they used to have these private parties. Now, it was a thing that if you could get somebody like Hutch, and they would yell out for songs, but the one thing that really got him was Let's Do It. Sometimes that filled half his program.
In Spain, the best of us, let's do it. Lithuanians, and let's do it. So let's do it. Let's fall in love.
The women used to jump up and shout and scream and wave their arms and belly for encores. Very often after he'd done about 3 encores of Let's Do It, somebody would say, you know, you can do that again, and he'd go off on a completely different version of Let's Do It.
Say in Boston even beans do it. So let's do it. Let's fall in love.
The celebrity and to some extent notoriety Hutch managed to create for himself in the 1930s seemed to transcend any barrier. And what is remarkable is how a black West Indian was able to become a part of the richest and most elite sets of pre-war London.
Let's fall in love.
Amongst the circles he was now moving in, his colours seemed to merely add to his allure.
Hutch's colour was central. In London, there was a certain advantage to being an exotic, and he was, if you wish, like a Nigerian prince, who was unique in everybody's experience, and initially just that, a bit like a pet, if you will. And he looked beautiful, because he was beautiful, and he sang and performed marvellously well. But Londoners were quite quickly prepared to accept that he was an intelligent human being, and that must have been a relief to him.
There was tremendous affection for Fats Waller. There was tremendous affection for Billie Holiday. And they were American, but Hutch was ours. I think that was the thing. The British sort of upper classes particularly took to their bosom. And, you know, this is our star, and this is our man, and this is Hutch, and this is our Hutch, and he sings our songs, and we can ask for them, and he will do what we want.
We know that bears in their pits do it, even Pekinese at the Ritz do it. Let's do it, let's fall in love.
But outside of the rich London elite, the realities of racism in pre-war Britain did affect Hutch. But even here, his growing fame seemed to overcome the problems of race.
He was affected by it, most of all, in the provinces, rather than in London itself, because many of his audiences would not have seen a black man in their lives before, and very often he would not have been allowed to stay in the local Grand Hotel. That changed in the 30s. By the end of the 30s, he was so famous that there really was nowhere where he would not have been allowed to stay. But by the beginning of the 30s, that was not the case. So sometimes it was extremely humiliating for him, and he must have swallowed an enormous amount of bile and anger while he was directed to the servants' entrance. And I think that must have happened very often.
What took Hutch to the provinces was his move to become a variety performer as well as a cabaret star. This change of tactics, along with his recording contracts and his own energy, was to make him immensely rich. Charlotte Breeze.
He quickly broadened what he could do so that he was running his own nightclub. He was also recording, so that he in fact produced 450 records altogether. And he was soon touring with a completely different audience, a working class audience, by the end of the 20s, in the old variety halls all over England, and singing now to audiences of 2,000 and 3,000 people. A completely different experiment and experience for him, very many of whom had never seen a black man in their lives. So there was a big adjustment for the audiences as much as there was for Hutch, and he stopped playing and singing these complicated social songs of Cole Porter's and started singing much broader based, more emotional repertoire. And he then started, perhaps at that moment, to start diverging as several different people.
Remind me of you.
Thank you, Hutch. What a delightful song that is. And you sing romantic numbers like that as if they were personal and private to you.
Believe it or not, while I'm singing them, they are.
I can well believe that, Hutch. While you're singing, the studio and we just don't exist.
How right you are, Peter, how right you are.
The thing which struck me about Hutch was the way in which he seemed to act and speak like a British aristocrat. Close your eyes and you'd never have known he was black. Simon Becker, who knew Hutch in the 1950s.
He sounded very, very upper class, and I think he rather cultivated that accent. I never ever heard him talk with a trace of West Indian accent.
Throughout the 1930s, Hutch became more and more a star. His records and constant touring made him a millionaire. He was constantly recording new songs, and he'd become a regular voice on radio. He was even trying his hand at the new art of radio advertising.
Purcell presents Purcell Personalities, intimate broadcast by the great stars of our time. All this week, Purcell tops the bill with Leslie A. Hutchinson, or Hutch as you all know him, variety's most sophisticated star. You'll sing your way through washing day if you'll let Purcell help you. When you hang up the washing, its glorious whiteness will thrill you. And apart from making the clothes spotlessly clean, Purcell's wonderful gentleness will keep them like new for years.
Hutch's success on the variety stage not only made him a household name, it also attracted the highest form of flattery, imitation. Lou Lane.
A lot of people used to do impressions of him, and the one person that used to really send him up, and I would have thought that he would have gone a bit mad, was Max Waugh. And Max and him became friends. And he did this parody of Hutch, you know, with Vienna. And from the side, of course, Hutch would come out, put his hands on his hips and look at him like this. Then they'd both sit down. He would say, "I'll show you how it's done." And they'd both sit down and they would do a duet together.
Other performers, such as Terry Thomas, joined in with impressions of their own, and one act even wrote a song called "The Night Hutch Forgot His Handkerchief." But Hutch's willingness to join in the joke was not appreciated by his most ardent fans, like Jessie Pilling.
It was the two Leslies, like Leslie Holmes, Leslie Saroni. They sang a number that, to me, was odious. It was about Hutch, and it was so bad. They ridiculed him. I wrote to the two Leslies, and I complained that an artist of his standing should not be ridiculed for them to get a cheap laugh out of somebody who was a far better performer than they were. I got a letter back from the two Leslies calling me a very silly girl, that Hutch fully approved. He knew about it, he fully approved of it. Anyway, I wrote a letter back and I thanked them for taking the time and the cost of a postage stamp to reply to such a silly person.
I should like you all to know I'm a famous gigolo, and of lavender my nature's got just a dash in it.
Throughout the 30s and 40s, Hutch had been conducting affairs with many of the society women he entertained in cabaret. But his affairs were soon to undermine the success he'd worked for, Charlotte Breese.
Hutch's affairs were scandalous at the time. The bright young things, these socialites in their 20s, were all crazy about Hutch, very many of them, and they jumped into bed with him, and some of them had his babies. And it was a disastrous thing for Hutch, although he didn't understand it, that the scandals that surrounded him were scandals that were to mar his future. It was a long time before he could get alongside the royal family after his extremely scandalous affair with Edwina Mountbatten.
To fans who idolized Hutch, the news of his affairs was a shock.
I've learned since Hutch died, I've been disillusioned by his affairs with other women, but common sense tells me that a man as elegant, as well known and talented, away from home for long spells of time, is not going to refuse anything that's thrown at him. Women were actually going out of the way to fall under his charm, you know. Everywhere he went, he had a woman on his arm. And it's understandable under those circumstances. And yet, although I am disillusioned to learn all that, it hasn't made a shred of difference to how I feel about him as a performer. I just wish that I could have been one of those women.
I'm a gigolo.
Of all Hutch's affairs, his liaison with Edwina Mountbatten, the wife of Prince Philip's uncle, Earl Mountbatten, the future Viceroy of India, was the most scandalous. Hutch's affair with Edwina was to have a disastrous effect on his life. The scandal led to him being censured by the establishment. Hutch was no longer asked to appear at Royal Command performances. His radio work was reduced, and perhaps most damaging of all, he was simply made to disappear by sections of the press. Charlotte Breese again.
There certainly was quite a lot of prejudice as a result of the scandals, particularly the Mountbatten scandal. And it was truthful that Lord Beaverbrook put him on what was called his white list, and that simply meant that whenever he appeared, instead of reporting that Hutch had been entertaining, however large the audience or the venue, Beaverbrook's staff would be instructed to say that the audience was otherwise entertained with more music, but no one would mention that Hutch was performing.
Beaverbrook's white listing of Hutch was one of the reasons he's been forgotten, but the main cause was his decline after the war. When the war came, Hutch was still one of Britain's greatest stars, despite the efforts of Beaverbrook. But the war changed everything.
He was a success through the war, and he was disappointed not to have been allowed to join up, which is what he wanted to do, or even to go abroad and entertain the troops. But as a black man, it was considered too great a risk. And also, he was known to be good at entertaining the ladies on the home front, so he was left at home. And it was by the end of the war that circumstances had changed greatly. He'd put on a lot of weight and was drinking too much, and his mind and his spirit was miserable, really, by the end of the war. I think people were coming back. They'd been greatly honoured. He felt himself ignored, and his efforts largely so as well. And because the world was changing, so the cabaret world was much less, and his contracts with recording companies faltered and then failed, and he stopped working to a great extent.
Among the voices on the boulevard, there's one who seems to call my name.
I sometimes think I ought to sing songs like that instead of the more sentimental ones that I do sing. I often wonder if people get tired of them.
Never in your life, Hutch. They'll never get tired of the sentimental songs you sing and the way that you sing them.
This is not the same.
The war seemed to signal the end of cabaret and the end of Hutch. His decline in the 1940s might well have been the end of his career. But the austerity and drabness of the 1950s, in the end, came to his rescue. Simon Becker.
It was just one of those periods when people were coming out of the blue, depressing period. We were still feeling the aftermath of the post-war period. And, of course, nightclubs and evening entertainment were non-existent. And suddenly it was all happening, you know, and you saw pictures of the Duke of Windsor playing golf in his +4s and the correspondent shoes. It was just one of those things, and Hutch was very much a sort of centerpiece of the resurgence.
The 50s comeback for Hutch came suddenly, and by the mid-50s, he was back in Quaglines and several of the other clubs in London. And he was also performing in the provinces. His new audience was the Princess Margaret set, just as it had been that of her mother in the 20s.
It was in this period that I met Hutch. I was then living in Calcutta with my parents, when he used to come to India every year to perform in cabaret at the Grand Hotel. He was spending each winter touring around the crumbling remains of the empire, Kenya, India, Australia, and Hong Kong, in search of audiences who had known him in the 30s and 40s, who loved him and who would treat him as a star. But nobody who met him in those years could really think that he was anything but a fading star, an anachronism. In 1966, he gave this interview to the BBC while touring in Hong Kong.
Well, your songs were part of an era, the same as many other people at that time.
Yes.
Now, do you find that the people today, the younger people, appreciate this sort of music, Hutch?
Strangely enough, yes.
I always think it's a little unfair when people talk about you in a way and say that you are the darling of Mayfair and so on. This is true, but I remember back, I'm old enough to remember back to the days when all sorts of people loved your songs, Hutch.
But of course.
Not only Mayfair.
No. Don't forget, for 10 years I played on the stage. I was top of the bill for 10 years.
Oh, you went round Mossie's Empires, I remember.
Remember,
yes,
I had a contract 3 years at a time.
Yes,
3 years at a time. I topped the bill over Billy Cotton, over anybody you like to name. And I have the things to prove it.
Yes, indeed, I remember seeing you there. What about the white handkerchief? Do you still use that?
Yes, I use it here. It's wonderful. I use it here at the Mandarin because in this charming room it gets a little hot. A lot of people.
I think the thing, you know, that...
all of these travels gave him a little lift each time, because he found the people who'd stayed on, the people who remembered him, the people who had themselves stood still. But he couldn't ever regain his own popularity in England. And he even tried to get back to Harlem in 1958, which seems the most pathetic effort of all, really. And he realized, perhaps for the first time, that he couldn't get back inside a black skin, even if he wished to. It was too late for that. He'd made himself a complex, stranded man. He didn't belong anywhere anymore.
Hutch had become a black star at a time when there were very few black people in Britain. But everything was changing, and it brought out the very worst in Hutch.
Arrivals at Tilbury, 500 Jamaicans. In Jamaica, they couldn't find work. Discouraged but full of hope, they sailed for Britain.
Hutch didn't like the influx of black migrants to England because he had been used to relying on his individuality and the fact that nobody understood where he'd come from. And all of a sudden there were far too many people around who defined him as far as he was concerned. So he became extraordinarily racist, really, and extremely disloyal to his own upbringing, and was heard to mutter endlessly when he used to hang out in the Old Bailey to entertain himself in the mornings. As somebody black was sent down for something like stealing, he would say, "I expect the black bastard deserved it."
But there was another skeleton in Hutch's cupboard, one which even most of his friends only got to know after his death in 1969. I had known Hutch for 15 years, and like everybody else, I didn't know he was married until I read his obituaries.
He never spoke about his wife. He'd never speak about everything else, but he'd never speak about his wife. And I guess I never asked.
Hutch married when he was in America, and Ella went with him to Paris. And there are mentions in the press of the Hutchinsons in London when they first arrived, being part of a rather glitzy black set with people like the Robesons. But quite soon afterwards, everything to do with Ella Hutchinson seems to have been airbrushed out by Hutch, because he didn't feel that she had a contribution to make. Rather on the contrary, he felt her a liability. So she has stayed at home in their huge house in Hampstead, and kept chickens in the garden, and played bridge with her friends, and was not seen by his friends and girlfriends when they went to the house. And she used to iron his shirts and send them by the week to wherever he was working. And the curious part about all this is that they do seem to have been rather friends. They actually talked on the telephone and spent some time exchanging news and views about their daughter and about their lives, so that they didn't fall out.
Or is it a misunderstanding? I hope so. And the moon remembered, but you forgot.
Leslie Hutchinson was without doubt an extremely selfish man. He hurt many people along the way. But even with all his failings, he should, I think, still be remembered, and for the most part, fondly. Perhaps I'm biased, because I knew him as a friend. But to forget the man is to lose the many songs he performed so fabulously. It's hard to imagine that Cabaret and Hutch are poised for a comeback. But I do hope he hasn't said goodbye for the last time.
And here we have to say goodbye, listeners, but only until the same time tomorrow. Say goodbye to them for now, Hutch.
Goodbye to you, everybody, and thank you. I shall be so happy to sing to you again tomorrow and every afternoon this week. Goodbye.
And this is Petey York saying goodbye too, listeners. But don't be late tomorrow. Hutch has some wonderful songs for you.
Well, goodbye. Goodbye.
Thank you, Leslie. I'm sure our listeners enjoyed that.
In Search of Hutch was presented by Nigel Dempster and produced